Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's keynote webinar titled Towards Multi-System Neural Network Models of Brain Functions. This webinar is part of the 11th annual event in the Neuroscience Virtual Event Series. And I'm Susie Valdez of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. So let's get started. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during this presentation. You can find that live chat located on the left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you want during this presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of this presentation. Now, if you have any trouble seeing or hearing this presentation, simply click on that help desk button located at the top of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby. And finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the continuing education credits link located in the abstract tab from the window on the left of your screen and follow the process to obtain those credits. I now present today's speaker, Dr. Robert Yang, an assistant professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences and computational neuroscientist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. For a complete biography of our speakers, please visit the presenter tab from the menu on the left of your screen. Dr. Yang, welcome. You may now begin your presentation, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation from LabRoots, and thank you for the introduction. So do I click push to audience, I guess? Okay. So, So I'm going to talk about towards, okay. I can see the group chat as well. I'm seeing some friends. Towards multi-system network models for cognitive neuroscience. So I'll start with some high-level opinion, and then I'll talk about two concrete stories that we have been working on. Neither is published yet, so welcome any feedback. For many of you, this is kind of a cliche, but I'll still mention it anyway. So neural networks, artificial neural networks, right? So the kind of powerhouse behind AI. Is not only useful for AI, but it can also help us understand brains and minds. So many people have talked about it. So together with Xiaojing Wang, so we wrote this little primer piece that kind of help orient people who are new to this topic. So this is kind of like an educational piece. So if you want to get into this field, you're welcome to check it out. But so neural networks can be used as data analysis tools. So this is similar to how it's being used for in other fields as well. But it has a special relationship with the brain, as in it can be used directly or after some modification as computational models of the brain. And they're useful because they can help us model complex behaviors. They can help us model complex activity patterns, and they can help us understand the brain from an optimization perspective, or people call deep learning perspective, where, for example, besides looking at the specific mechanisms of how some function is carried out in the neural network, you can try to understand the constraints, the neural architecture constraint, the optimization process, and the objective function that the network is trying to achieve. So this is similar to how we understand biology through evolution theory. Okay, so today I will focus on general purpose recurrent neural networks, and they're used for cognitive neuroscience. So recurrent neural networks are a particular kind of artificial neural networks, and people have been studying them for many, many decades. For about 20, 30 years, people have studied general purpose recurrent neural networks. So these are networks that can be trained to do many, many different tasks, and I'll explain to you in some more details. So first, usually we start with some cognitive task, because this is to understand cognitive neuroscience, right? How how people and animals think and make decisions, etc. So you would start with a cognitive task. So we would keep going back to this classical task developed by Monte, Susillo, Shenoy, and Newsom. So in this case, the monkey would look at some colored random dots, and these dots are moving left and right, and the colors are green and red. And the monkey, depending on this little context cue that is on the bottom of the screen, they have to decide either whether the dots are more red versus green, or whether the dots are moving to the left or to the right. So this is a so-called context-dependent decision-making task. Right? So you would take a task like this, or you can take other tasks that people have trained animals to do or humans to do. And then you take a recurrent neural network. So these networks are called recurrent because so the neurons are usually connected to one another, and quite often there's no structure, but you can also add some structure in it, so they can be sparsely connected, for example. But let's say for now that these neurons are connected all to all, so everyone is connected to everyone, and what you will do is then adjust the connections in the network, so between the neurons, so that this network can do this cognitive task, right? And usually the way that you adjust it, the most common way, is to take something from machine learning, let's say a gradient descent method, but you can also use other learning rules if you want, and we'll talk about that. So with these three elements, right, the learning problem, the network architecture, and some learning rule, then we can produce a network that can do the task. And then at the same time, we can compare this network to an animal that has learned to do this task, and specifically from the brain recording from that animal that can do this task. So I'm not going to explain this, but so essentially you can do some specific analysis of the data and compare that across the model and the brain. So this is a pretty classical paradigm, I would say now. It's used in many studies. But today I'll mainly talk about the problem with that and how we need to move beyond it. So together with Francis Song and Xiaojing Wang, so back in 2016, that feel like really a long time ago. So we also try to use this paradigm for many other tasks, and in most cases we're able to reproduce in our model what people have found in the data, right? So which shows that this paradigm, just like many others have shown, can be quite useful. But I'll first share some opinion about why we have to move beyond. So there are many challenges with using artificial networks to model the brain. I talked about the advantage, right, before, but there are also many problems. Some are shared across other domains. For example, we talked about the learning rule is often backpropagation, gradient descent based, that is powered through this backpropagation algorithm, and it's been known for 30 years. It's not obvious how the brain can do it, although there's a lot of cool work showing that maybe the brain can do it in some form. But this is a problem that is shared with other applications. And then there's a problem of neural networks being hard to interpret. So that's also a general problem. But there are also some specific problems when you use these recurrent neural networks in this paradigm to model cognitive task. So one thing is that so cognition is really, it's flexible, right? It's not about just doing one thing. Oh, sorry, the order is wrong here. So first is cognition involves many regions. So people have shown that usually for decision making, there's widespread computation across the brain, both in cortical and subcortical areas that are involved for any cognitive task. So when we use a single recurrent network here, right, that's clearly not sufficient to capture the diverse responses across these many brain regions. Another problem is cognition is very flexible, right? But when you use a single recurrent network, an RNN, and you train it on a one task, it's not flexible, right? That's all it can do is that one task. So that's another problem. And another problem is usually when animals or humans go into the lab and trying to learn and perform a task, you're not starting from like a random neural network in your brain, right? Your brain has existing circuitry. You can already do many things, and you're building on top of that. But when you train a network from scratch, then you're essentially ignoring all the evolution and developmental history, right? And that can lead to a lot of problems as well. So there are other problems, but I think these three are really fundamental challenges to this classical paradigm of using recurrent neural networks for cognitive neuroscience. So how do we move beyond that? If we describe this first generation broadly as a single task, single network, and using some backpropagation, so in this little opinion piece that Manuel Milano Mazon and I published a couple of years ago, we argued that okay, we need to really move beyond it, and we need to go to a future where our network are focused on really naturalistic cognition that is flexible and can do many things. We have to think about multiple brain regions and perhaps multiple cell types. And then we need to think about biological learning rules and diverse plasticity rules. So, and I want to emphasize that we have to do that not just because these are things that exist in the brain, right? We're not advocating for just putting things in your network because they exist in the brain. We're advocating to think about these things because otherwise we might be studying recurrent networks, artificial networks that are operating in fundamentally different ways from the brain. So, and over the years, I have been fortunate to participate in some works that kind of touch upon all of these different problems. I won't go into them today, but you're welcome to check some of these papers out. But to summarize what I've said about this opinion part is that we need to move forward from this classical paradigm to build these multi-region, multi-cell type, multi-plasticity rules network that can perform more natural cognition. And this is, I think, in some way echoed by folks in AI when they're saying we need to build models that are not just a single monolithic network, but a network that has like diverse modules focusing on different functions. So today, so that's the end of my opinion part. Now I'll show you some actual science, okay? And I'll focus today on the multi-system part. So what do I mean by multi-system, right? So in the middle of this future part, I talked about multi-area. So this means multi-brain regions. But if you think beyond just brain regions, you can think about how the brain consists of different neural systems, like a visual system, cognitive system, motor system, and so on, right? So this is a coarse separation, and it's not so clean, but for now, let's just say there are different systems, and usually people focus on individual systems at a time, right? There can be multiple brain regions in each system, but really the brain is integrated and involve multiple systems. So today we will focus on multi-system network, so going even beyond multi-area network. And I want to first show you that how multi-system models can offer new insights into classical questions, right? As a way to show you why we should care about these multi-system models. So I'll focus on a problem that is really close to my heart. So this is when I did my PhD in Xiaojing Wang's lab at NYU. The lab is kind of famous for studying working memory and decision making. And working memory is a capability to keep, for example, some items and some objects in a short amount of time in your mind, and then maybe manipulate that object and use it for future use. So this is a really important function, yet it is severely limited. So people have known for really 70 years that working memory has a very, very strong capacity limit, right? So I can, for example, ask you to remember some numbers, and some people can remember some numbers better than others, but usually people can only remember something like 4 or 2 to 8 numbers, right? If I tell you some random numbers. So this is kind of odd, right? Because we have so many neurons in our brain, and this is something that a computer can do trivially, right? And we could do it easily as well if we have some paper and pen. So how come our brain with all these neurons is so bad at it, right? And we have known this phenomena for 70 years. It is one of the first phenomena that we know in cognitive science, and yet we still don't know why, right? We have a lot of quantification of it, like the exact capacity, but we don't know why it's here. So of course, people have proposed different ideas. So the psychologists have proposed that maybe that's because we have limited slots or limited memory resources, right, in our brain. But it's not satisfying. These explanations are not satisfying because it's like, why do we have limited slots, right? Why do we have limited resources? You're kind of kicking the ball farther down the line, and we're still not answering the question why. Right? Now then, some people proposed some neuromechanistic answers to why we have a limit. Right? So one influential idea is that memories are stored in these so-called attractors, and it's okay if you don't know what that means. But then these attractors would interfere with one another, right? And another idea is that working memory is stored in oscillatory patterns, and you can only fit so many items in your memory in one oscillation cycle. And another idea, which is kind of a neural instantiation of the resource idea in psychology, is that we have limited number of spikes in our brain, right? So at any given moment, we have only this many spikes. So and you have to use spikes to encode information, right? So if you have a limited number of spikes, then maybe you just can't store everything that you want to store. So all of these ideas essentially point to some essentially biophysical limit to why we have a working memory capacity limit, right? So one challenge in general is to answer why when we have more neurons, we cannot overcome this limit. For example, the human has several orders of magnitude more neurons than monkey and mouse, right? Yet we have a working memory capacity that is on the same order of magnitude, right? It's in all cases, all these animals have a capacity that is less than 10. So how come we have so many more neurons yet comparable capacity? So there is one normative idea out there, which is working memory is important for flexibility. So I want to acknowledge that this is one idea that's really influential for us. And we kind of also started wanting to test this idea. So this is the idea that, sorry. This is the idea that for working memory to be very, very flexible, as we want them to be, and you have to pay a price, and then you cannot store many things simultaneously, because so I won't go into the details, but this is kind of our original hypothesis as well. So now I'll tell you some more details about how this capacity limit is tested in, for example, monkeys that don't understand numbers, right? And you can also use that for humans as well. So here we focus on visual working memory. So this is where you show people a sequence of pictures, and they have to kind of remember something about the pictures. In this particular paradigm, which we'll call a change detection task, you're first shown in the sample period, for example, 3 colored squares. It can be less, it can be more. The number of colored squares is called the set size, and the arrow here is the time in the task. And so you're first shown these 3 colored squares, and then there's a delay period when you don't see anything. It's just a gray screen, and then you see another 3 squares that appeared at the same location as the original 3 squares, and mostly have the same colors, but with, for example, 50% probability, one of the colored square would change its color. Now the question is to report whether or not there is a change, right? Here the chance level is 50%. And then, so if you ask people to do it, as you increase the set size, right, which is a number of colored squares, the percent correct really goes down very rapidly. And so this is the change detection task. And then there's a different paradigm, which is you can call it a continuous report task, where you're again showed colored squares and then a delay. But then there's a Q period when a single Q stimulus is shown, and you need to report the color of the square that that was shown during the sample period that's at the same location as a Q. Okay, so here essentially you should report orange, right? Because orange, the orange square is at the same location as a black square during the Q period, and you need to report that on a color ring. So this task is nice because you can assess the arrow of your report, and that arrow is a kind of a continuous variable. So there's a lot that you can learn from that, the distribution of that arrow. And if you look at, for example, how big that arrow is, so this is a standard deviation of your report, and it grows very, very rapidly with a number of items. So now let's try to build neural networks that can do this. So I want to say this is all the work done with 2 talented students, Yudixie and Guangyu, also with help from Chris Cueva, who's a postdoc in the lab. So first, what we will do is build a 2-system model that involves a convolutional neural network and a recurrent neural network. So here, this convolutional neural network is one of these models used to model the visual systems. And so people have shown that these models, when trained on large naturalistic visual data sets, you can obtain essentially neural network models of the visual system as good as it gets. And then we have these models process the raw visual inputs, right, the pixel inputs, and then it will feed into a recurrent neural network, which is then asked to do the task. So now in this particular case, we will train both the convolutional neural networks, the CNN, and the recurrent neural networks, the RNN, on this single task. We will train the whole thing, every connection weight in these networks. And what we see here is that in this so-called end-to-end trained network, the performance is very high, right? It doesn't depend on the set size, and so you can do it perfectly. So it's nothing like the humans. And this is also true for the continuous report task. So it's way better than humans. I know you might say, well, this is not surprising, right? It's 2023, we have ChatGPT. What's a big deal that neural networks are better than humans, right? But remember, our original puzzle is exactly why humans are so bad at this, right? We want to understand why humans are bad at this. For when working memory looks like an important function, right? And seeing that you can easily train some neural networks to beat human kind of further emphasize this puzzle. But maybe but let's think about the hypothesis that others have proposed, right? So one idea is that we have limited number of spikes, right, in the brain. That's why we cannot remember this so well. Here we're using these so-called rate neural networks, so we don't have spikes, but we can try to mimic the effect of spikes by injecting noise into the neurons. So this is just private noise that try to corrupt the activity of the neurons. Now, we can also try to limit the size of our network, try to make it smaller, and see if we can constrain the capacity that way. Now, it turns out if you do that, do either of these things, it doesn't work. You can successfully bring the overall performance down as expected, right? If you inject lots of noises, you will essentially not be able to do any task meaningfully, right? Similarly, if you make your model very, very small, it won't be able to do the task. But the way that it fails is interesting. So here, again, we're plotting the performance in this change detection task as a function of the set size. And you can see that when you make the model smaller or you add noise, the performance kind of decreases in a uniform fashion, unlike the human, where it's dependent on the set size. And we have some ideas why this is happening. But when we first saw this, it was pretty interesting. Right? So this suggests that at least in our networks, we cannot get human-like capacity limit by injecting noise, and at least in these end-to-end trained networks. So what can we do? Now, a very natural thing to try is to, instead of train this convolutional neural network end to end, right? We would train it like the way that vision neuroscientists train their networks, meaning that we would train the network on some naturalistic visual data sets. So what I will show you is results where we train the network on this pretty small data set called Cypher10, which is just a classification data set on some natural images. It's a small data set, but we have also tried that on larger data set. We have tried not just classification task, we have tried self-supervised learning, contrastive training task, and the results hold. But today I will only show you the results on classifying on Cypher10. Okay, and voila. If you try these networks, then almost immediately you get a more human-like capacity limit, right? So I'm under no illusion that it's perfect, right? But for us, this is pretty striking because we didn't do anything, right? All we did is to train the convolutional neural networks on some naturalistic task. And we're also able to match the performance almost quantitatively in the continuous report task. So I want to emphasize that this is not a fit. So we didn't try to essentially fit the network to these human behavior. Right? All we did is to train the convolutional network the way that vision neuroscientists would train them, and then we're able to capture this limit. So these results would suggest that pre-training visual system is actually sufficient to obtain human-like working memory limit and these in these tasks. So there is a caveat, but I'm happy to go into it in the Q&A. But for the sake of time, I'll move on now. And I'll just also briefly say that besides these two measures that I've shown you, our models can also match the data and many other important measures that people have looked at over the decade. For example, when you have higher set size in the continuous reports task, you have wider error distribution. When the network or the human is more confident, your report tend to be more accurate. So your essentially distribution of report is more centered around the correct option. If you give a cue, right, not to be confused as a final cue in the continuous report, but an early cue that tells you where you're more likely to be cued upon later, then you tend to be more accurate. And our network can do that as well. And then finally, you can vary the change, how big you change the color, and match what people have seen in animals as well. So we get all of these for free, right? So we didn't try to do anything to match any particular data set here. Okay, so this is a flexible working memory part. So just to summarize, here we're showing you just by using a visual system that is built in a way similar to how visual neuroscientists would build them anyway, we're able to capture many phenomena that people have observed in working memory, right? Which is suggesting that working memory, a thing that is thought to be, intuitively a cognitive phenomena, that if you have a limit, it must be, a cognitive bottleneck. We're able to see that we can actually explain it to some extent using just a realistic visual system. Okay, so I hope this convinced you that it's important to look at multi-system networks, but multi-system networks are hard, right? And I'll tell you why. So first, there are many different ways to build your sensory system, right? And there are many different ways to build your cognitive system. But then you have more complexity trying to put them together. And this is just the architecture. But then when you throw training in the mix, as we have just seen, there are different ways that you can train the network. You can train the network end-to-end on some task, or you can pre-train some part of it on some task and then train another part on another task, right? So there's a huge variety of possibilities here, right? A huge design space of these networks. So how do we navigate all this design space, right? Just to, again, talk about this complexity, for the RNN, you can build more biologically grounded continuous time RNNs, or you can use more machine learning type RNNs called LSTMs that actually people don't really use in machine learning anymore. Everyone uses transformers, right? So you can use these different recurrent neural networks, and you can also use different types of inputs to your recurrent networks. You can use very simple stylized input like people have done in the past, or you can use these convolutional networks as input like I've shown you. So there's a lot of complexity here. So how do we navigate that? So one idea, and it's not the only idea, but one idea is to rely on quantitative scores that can allow us to screen many models. And lots of people have worked on this, right? We feel pretty late to the game in many ways, but people have already used this in the visual system extensively, been used to study the language system. But here today, we just want to use it on the cognitive system and see what we can find. Okay, so I'll tell you a bit more, but this is work led by postdoc Chris Cueva with a brilliant team of visiting students and interns, Nathan Cruz, Mo Fan Lee, Meg Pota, and Catherine Zhou. So I've shown you this slide earlier, right, where we have, this is essentially the classic paradigm. We have a learning problem, a neural network, and a learning rule. And we would get a model and compare that to data, right? Simple as that. Now let's just scale this up by looking at many data sets instead of one, right? What's limiting us, right? Let's look at 100. But I'll only show you 2 today. So then let's not just look at one type of network and one type of learning rule. Let's look at many types of networks, many types of learning rules, etc. And finally, once you have these many networks and many data sets, it helps to have a way to summarize the result that you get from each network and each data set, because you are going to have 10,000 or more of these, right? So you cannot afford to look at pictures like the nice pictures like I'm showing you on the right, but 10,000 times. We cannot afford that. So let's summarize the model data comparison into some quantitative similarity score, but in our case, we'll look at distance. So the neural distance essentially is lower. If it's lower, it means the model is similar to the experimental data. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'll actually skip this slide, but I'm happy to come back to it if people have questions. But this is just to say that although we're looking at quantitative scores, it's also important to also do qualitative analysis that people have developed, many clever analysis that people have developed, so that we can better understand what it means when we have a quantitative difference. So I'll actually explain it briefly. So you can do some qualitative analysis on some brain data. So here we have this data called Susilo 2015, which is just a monkey, reaching to different targets and then recording from their motor areas. You can do some qualitative analysis, get some curves, and then you can do the same thing, and I'll show you results from 2 recurrent networks, and where you can see the network in the middle is much more similar to the data than the network on the right. So I would call this a qualitative difference that is revealed by this analysis. And when you do a quantitative comparison, you can get this Procrustes distance that Alex Williams and colleagues have developed recently, and this distance range from 0 to 1 to half pi, and 0 means that the model and the data are very close. And you can see here that the good network, the network that is close to data, has a distance of 0.6, and the bad networks has a distance of 0.8. Right? So here, even a distance difference in 0.2 can be meaningful. Now, we will look at this Procrustes distance on this particular data set now at the y-axis, but what should be our x-axis, right? So here I will just briefly talk about different ways that we can choose this x-axis and how we can make many discoveries depending on the x-axis and depending on what we see. For example, we can plot on the x-axis the training time when you train a single neural network. And naively, you would imagine that as you train the network, it gets closer and closer to the brain. But it doesn't have to be this way, right? It could be as you train it, it gets better, and then as you further train it, it gets worse. Or it can be at some point during the training, there's an abrupt change that it gets much closer to the brain. You can also plot on the x-axis the task performance, how well you do this task after training. And you can imagine that the better you are at this task, the closer you are to the brain. So here, each dot would correspond to a network, a single network, and here we're analyzing multiple networks. But you could also see something like this, where when you get really good at the task, you actually deviate from the brain, right? And you can look at different types of architectures and see that some of them are really much closer to the brain than others, even when you control for the task performance. And you can look at learning rule variations, right? Let's not just do backpropagation, let's try some plasticity rules, and you can do this as well, right? So we have done all of these, but I don't have time to show you all of them. And I can already tell you that there are many interesting things that we find, and some are intuitive and some are counterintuitive. But today I will show you a different x-axis where we plot the distance when evaluated on a different data set. So this is this Monte data set that I already explained in the beginning. It's a classical data set. Lots of people have worked on it. But we want to essentially look at how a single network, how essentially a single set of hyperparameters perform in these two data sets, right? So here, essentially, we take one hyperparameter setting, and we would train two networks, right, with the same hyperparameter setting. Each network is trained on one of these tasks and compare it to the corresponding data set. And then we can repeat that for different hyperparameters, right? And by that, I mean different neural architectures, different network size, different noise level, etc. And there are, again, many, many things you could find here, right? For example, you could find that there's a strong correlation across data sets. This would be nice because this means that whatever you find in one data set may translate to another data set. But this doesn't have to happen, right? It's possible that we find weak correlation across data sets, which would raise a lot of questions about how much you can translate your findings from one data set to another, right? You could see very little variations across hyperparameters, right? In this case, it suggests that performing the task would give you very strong constraint on the solution, that there would be very little variations across them as long as they can do the task. But you can also, even in this case, it depends. You can have consistently bad models, or you can have consistently good models, right? Again, when the distance are smaller, the network is closer to the brain. Then finally, you can also color the dots differently, right? According to, let's say, the neural architecture or something else. And you could see that some architectures consistently outperform other architecture, or some architectures, or the architectures are similar, or one architecture is better than the other architecture, but only for one data set, but not for the other. So I went through all these possibilities to show you that there are really many things that we can learn in these plots. And it's really unclear what we will learn because people haven't really done these plots a lot for cognitive neuroscience. So next, I will show you exactly what we found when we did this analysis. And so before we go into the details, so here's what we did. For each task, we trained 1,620 networks that are the full combination of 3 neural architectures, 3 activation functions, 3 network sizes, 4 types of regularizations, 3 noise levels, and 5 random seeds. So there's a lot you can analyze here, but we will only color them by architectures now. And you can focus on different axes if you want. And there are many things. There are 4 things that we found in this pilot analysis. And all the networks I'm showing you also have task performance above a threshold. So they all perform the task similarly well. What we find is that, one, these continuous time RNNs, these are networks that are more biologically grounded, are actually better than the machine learning ones, although they're not like just they're not like better in the sense that the worst continuous time network is better than the best LSTM, right? So here we see there's a lot of overlap, but the best continuous time networks tend to be better than LSTMs. We also see that there's substantial variability across hyperparameters. So this is confirming something that many people have observed in practice, but I don't think people have reported that widely yet at scale, that when you train networks, there's actually a great amount of variability in terms of brain similarity. In these specific two data sets, we see a correlation, but I can already tell you that when we look at more data sets, we don't always see a correlation. So it's interesting to study why sometimes we see correlation and sometimes we don't. And finally, we see that here we have this dashed line, and I don't have time to explain that, but this is essentially a strong baseline. And we see that when we train the network, we can beat the baseline quite often, but sometimes it's actually worse than the baseline, which suggests that training network alone really doesn't guarantee you to have, in these cognitive tests, to have neural networks that are similar to the brain, right? Which raise caution to analyzing these networks before we kind of essentially figure out a consistent way to build good networks. So with that, I'll end by just saying that today I've shown you just a little piece of everything we're trying to do, essentially focusing on some hypothesis-driven qualitative analysis for working memory and some high-throughput quantitative analysis for recurrent networks. But there's a lot more to do. And of course, nothing would be possible without people in the lab who actually did the work. In particular, Yuri Xie and Duanyu led the working memory part, and Chris Cueva led the second part on recurrent networks. And also special thanks for Manuel Milano, who I wrote the opinion piece with, and of course, our funding sources and all our collaborators over the years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Yang, for that informative presentation. And we will now start the live Q&A portion of this webinar. If you have any questions you want to ask, please do so now. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. So let's get started. It looks like we have a couple of questions. Let's see. We've got one question coming in now, Dr. Yang. Our audience member says, about the working memory part, what happens if you show that stimuli sequentially instead of simultaneously?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this question. I mean, I asked it myself, so to give people time to type up their own questions. Now, I know there are many things here that I went through quickly, so feel free to ask whatever you want. Happy to go into details, any of this. But first, I'll just answer this question I asked myself. Okay, so in this working memory part, right? Let me show you this. So I've shown you that if we pre-train the convolutional network, then we can obtain a human-like capacity limit, right? So the implication here is that, okay, we simply cannot remember all these things, maybe because we cannot even see them simultaneously, right? But then, of course, the psychologists and cognitive scientists have thought about this possibility a long time ago, and they have tested it in humans by, instead of showing the stimuli simultaneously, you can show them sequentially, right? You can show them one at a time, or you can show them simultaneously, but allow humans to look at them as long as they want, so they can look at them essentially sequentially themselves. And people have shown that even in this case, you would have a working memory capacity limit. So now, can our result explain that? Can our network explain it? So this is one of the biggest, this is probably the biggest catch of the results I'm showing you now, which is if we do this sequentially, then you can, with this network I showed you, it actually still sees a capacity limit, but then you can increase your recurrent network size. You can make it larger, and then you would no longer see a capacity limit, in the sense that you can get your capacity to be as high as you want, as long as you have a large recurrent network, which is intuitive, right? Because if you show things sequentially, then your visual system is no longer constraining you. It's no longer limiting you. And if you have a very large cognitive system, here the recurrent network, then you should be able to just do as well as you want. So so we do know that if we keep the recurrent network size small enough, then we can limit the capacity limit. I want to say that alone is non-trivial, because before I've shown you in this end-to-end case that keeping the network size small doesn't necessarily lead to human-like capacity limit. It will give you some limit, all right, but not necessarily human-like. So the fact that we can limit the recurrent network size and see human-like limit is already encouraging. But of course, in the brain, that shouldn't be the right constraint, because in the brain, we know that we have many, many neurons in our parietal cortex and our prefrontal cortex. So I think there's a lot to be done here to understand the kind of realistic constraint that is posed to our recurrent networks for us to have capacity limit in the sequential presentation case.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yang. And our next question coming in, our audience member says, I was wondering if you could comment on the nature of explainability of this broader class of models.
Yeah, great question, and thank you, because this is a session on explainable AI, right? And I kind of didn't explicitly talk about that. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment on that. So I want to say, explainability is, of course, a general problem for AI, but they show up in different ways. If you're building self-driving car, right, and your car makes a mistake or makes some decision, just for accountability, you would like to be able to understand why it makes that decision, right? So that's explainability for the AI part. Now, for the brain, I think at least for me, the ultimate goal is to build neural networks that are like the brain. And I don't think the brain is necessarily explainable, in the sense that it's not necessarily explainable in the way that we want it to be explainable, right? In some way, there is no evolutionary pressure for the brain to be explainable to neuroscientists. We can try to explain it, but we may hit our limit. So personally, I don't think it's a huge problem that the brain is fundamentally difficult to explain, and our neural network models of them are fundamentally difficult to explain. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean we should not try, right? So I think neuroscientists, our job is to try to explain the brain despite the challenge. And that's why people have designed all these clever behavioral tasks, behavioral analysis, qualitative neural analysis, right? And I've shown you some today, right? Where we can, for example, do this fancy dimensionality reduction on the neural activity. We can do very targeted analysis on the behavior, and these will help us understand the brain and mind. And you can apply the same analysis, and this will help us understand neural networks. So this is a long-winded answer, but just to summarize, I think explainability in neural network models for the brain is different from explainability in AI in general. And it's okay okay that our neural networks are not necessarily that explainable, but we should still try to explain it the same way or in better ways that we try to explain the brain. I hope that I can't see people's facial expression, so I hope that makes sense to people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Yang. And I want to thank you for your presentation today. Would you like to provide any closing remarks for our audience before we go?
Yeah. So I want to say we're doing, so today this is kind of a high level view, right, with some opinion pieces. If you want to hear more about it, please feel free to reach out. And in particular, people in the lab will be very happy to give in detail explanation of their work. And if you're going to co-sign, we're presenting some of these at the co-sign conference starting tomorrow. Oh, sorry that someone said lost connection frequently. I mean, I'm sorry about that. There's little I can do about that. Is it me? Maybe the MIT Wi-Fi is bad.
You're fine.
Okay. All right.
Well, we do want to thank you again for your time and for your important research. And before we go, I also want to thank our audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today, and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by our speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. And this webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until March 8th, 2025. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone, and bye-bye.